All right, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning. Welcome back to another Bible study. We are in 2 Samuel again. We'll be in chapter 18 this morning, moving right along. So you can open up your Bibles a while, get into 2 Samuel chapter 18. And I know it's been a couple weeks, so we're going to go ahead and, as always, just do a quick refresher of what's going on. So this chapter makes even more sense to us. Like I said, you can always read the Bible wherever you're at, but it's always nice to read it in a flowing context of what's been going on. So we know back in chapter 15, after Absalom, David's son, was able to come back after killing, remember, he murdered Amnon for violating Tamar. He was able to come back, and he started this conspiracy to take over the throne, if you remember that. He was out at the gate convincing the men of Israel, and he stole their hearts away, it said. So David was wise and said, we better flee out of here. Absalom could kill us. It could be really bad. I don't want this war to happen. So him and his people fled. It was a really sad situation, but they got out of there. And David was still a very wise man, right? God's given him a lot of wisdom, so he arranged a secret communication network of spies that would report back to him in the wilderness, so he knew exactly what was going on back home, which was very important. Then in chapter 16, 2 chapters ago, we heard about how Ziba came with food, which is exactly what his people needed, food. He came there, and we know that Ziba was probably here to convince David, to trick him to think Mephibosheth is turning on him. A lot of us believe that Ziba was manipulating David here in his low point, and David said, sure, thanks for the food, whatever you want. You can have Mephibosheth's land, take it all, it's yours now. So we learned about how Ziba did that. That'll come back around later. And then we learned about a guy named Shimei. Remember, Shimei was a Benjaminite who was from Saul's family, and he hid up on the hill. He was afraid to get too close. He was actually probably wise to get too close, and he was throwing rocks at the people, and David said, Abishai's like, let me go cut his head off. Literally says, let me cut his head off. And that's probably what would happen in regular circumstances if you said something like this to the king. But David says, no, let God, maybe God told him to curse me. Even though Shimei was wrong, because Shimei was blaming this whole thing because of what he did to Saul, while he was half right, God was probably doing all this because of what he did to Uriah and Bathsheba, right? And David allows him, he throws dust and rocks at the people all the way. It says David's men were very weary. It was already a long journey, and then they're getting dust and rocks thrown at them. Not very fun. And then we learned to end that chapter, Absalom entered Jerusalem, and that prophecy was fulfilled, that what David did in private would be brought to light against him. And Ahithophel, one of David's wisest counselors, convinces Absalom to take David's 10 concubines in public and violate them, and the sin continues to go on and on and on. And that was also a really big statement, because that meant he was taking the throne, and it's something you can't undo. He could not undo that and apologize to his dad. It was like a permanent thing in Israel for somebody to do something like that. Then the last chapter we covered was chapter 17. If you remember, Absalom received counsel of what to do. Ahithophel had a wise plan. He said, hey, let me lead 12,000 men, and I'll go, and we'll take out David. It'll be quick and easy. We'll just kill David. That's all we want, and we'll get out of there, and you'll be king. But Hushai, remember, he was sent there as a double agent and said, no. You should gather all the people, and you should go yourself, Absalom. And he played upon his pride, because Absalom was full of himself. So it's easy to manipulate prideful people by playing into their ego. We do know this is true. And Absalom fell victim to that. Hushai talks him into it, and Hushai was really stalling, right? He was running the stall offense. So they could get David some time to regroup, because remember, they were really tired and weary, and they had to cross the Jordan River. They were still close, so they crossed that Jordan River then. And then remember, Jonathan and Ahimaaz, the two spies, we saw a biblical pattern, just like the story of Rahab. Rahab, the woman who had to hide the two spies, they also got hid in a well because they were spotted. They were trying to be discreet, but they were spotted by somebody, and Absalom's people were tipped off, hid them in the well. They were safe, and the message was preserved, just like we've seen before in scriptures. And then to end the chapter, we saw again Shobi, Machir, and Barzillai bring David and his men more provisions, more food. And it's just amazing to see how, Ziba and then these three men are bringing food out into the wilderness. You think of a wilderness, almost like a desert. There's not a lot going on out there. They couldn't bring a bunch of cattle or anything like that. So we saw how God provides, just kind of what we talked about earlier, how God provides provisions for the church. He provides provisions for his people. And it's very similar to Elijah. If you remember, Elijah has one of the most miraculous provisions, where a raven was bringing him food every day, which is pretty wild. Could you imagine, like a bird delivering your lunch every day? That's pretty wild. Doesn't happen often, if ever again, but that happened for Elijah. And it's just more proof that God is always providing, which leads us into chapter 18. So we'll go ahead, like we usually do. We'll read all chapter 18 and then break it down verse by verse to see what's going on here. All right. Verse number 1. Then David mustered the men who were with him and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, And David sent out the army, 1/3 under the command of Joab, 1/3 under the command of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the men, I myself will also go out with you. But the men said, You shall not go out, for if we flee, they will not care about us. If half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore it is better that you send us help from the city. The king said to them, Whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood at the side of the gate, while all the army marched out by hundreds and by thousands. And the king ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders about Absalom. So the army went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. And the men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David, and the loss there was great on that day, 20,000 men. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword. And Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. And a certain man saw it and told Joab, Behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak. Joab said to the man who told him, What, you saw him? Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt. But the man said to Joab, Even if I felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not reach out my hand against the king's son, for in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, For my sake, protect the young man Absalom. On the other hand, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there is nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof. Joab said, I will not waste time like this with you. And he took 3 javelins in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. And 10 young men, Joab's armor-bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. Then Joab blew the trumpet, and the troops came back from pursuing Israel, for Joab restrained them. And they took Absalom and threw him into a great pit in the forest, and raised over him a very great heap of stones. And all Israel fled everyone to his own home. Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up for himself the pillar that is in the king's valley, for he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar after his own name, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, Let me run and carry news to the king that the Lord has delivered him from the hand of his enemies. And Joab said to him, You are not to carry news today. You may carry news another day, but today you shall carry no news, because the king's son is dead. Then Joab said to the Cushite, Go, tell the king what you have seen. The Cushite bowed before Joab and ran. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, Come what may, let me also run after the Cushite. And Joab said, Why will you run, my son, seeing that you have no reward for the news? Come what may, he said, I will run. So he said to him, Run. Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and outran the Cushite. Now David was sitting between the 2 gates, and the watchman went up to the roof of the gate by the wall. And when he lifted up his eyes and looked, he saw a man running alone. The watchman called out and told the king. And the king said, If he is alone, there is news in his mouth. And he drew nearer and nearer. The watchman saw another man running. And the watchman called to the gate and said, See, another man running alone. The king said, He also brings news. The watchman said, I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. And the king said, He is a good man and comes with good news. Then Ahimaaz cried out to the king, All is well. And he bowed before the king with face to the earth and said, Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king. And the king said, Is it well with the young man Absalom? Ahimaaz answered, When Joab sent the king's servant, your servant, I saw a great commotion, but I do not know what it was. And the king said, Turn aside and stand here. So he turned aside and stood still. And behold, the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, Good news for my lord the king, for the Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all who rose up against you. The king said to the Cushite, Is it well with the young man Absalom? And the Cushite answered, May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man. And the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son. And that's how the chapter ends. A lot going on here. A really eventful chapter. We'll go ahead and start here with the first couple verses where David organizes his army for the battle in those first 8 verses. So if you look in the beginning, it says, David mustered the men who were with him and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. So we see David's back in leadership mode. He knows we're about to go to war. He's experienced in this. And you see it was, thousands and hundreds. This is Israel military organization tactics we've seen before. He's no novice. He's a pro at this. And he knows they need organization to win. That's what he does. Verse 2 says, And David sent out the army, 1/3 under the command of Joab, 1/3 under the command of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the men, I myself will also go out with you. So he breaks them this time into 3 divisions. He has Joab, who's been his longtime general, right? A really trustworthy, always impulsive and very ruthless at times. Joab's been a pretty trustworthy leader. They've won many battles with him at the head. Abishai, which remember, that's Joab's brother, the same guy that was ready to cut off the head of Shimei when he was cursing them. Very fierce, loyal man. Again, a little bit violent. We know the sons of Zeruiah were very violent men, but they were trustworthy leaders. And then the interesting third one was Ittai the Gittite. And if you remember, Ittai the Gittite was a Philistine exile. He was a former Philistine that came over. We read about in 2 Samuel 15. He came over, and David was amazed, so amazed by his loyalty here, that he actually puts him in charge of 1/3 of his army. So a foreigner, there's actually a foreigner leading the army, which I'm sure some of the Israelites are like, this is really strange. Some of his men are probably, this is strange, but we trust David and what he's doing. And they probably saw that Ittai was a pretty strong warrior and also knew what he was doing. And this is a reminder to us, just like always, that God can raise up very unlikely people for significant roles, right? And it also shows us the promise of the Gentiles being included in God's plan, right? So you see, even here in this big civil war, remember, this is another civil war. David's seen them over and over again. In the civil war, a Gentile is going to be in here and help David win this battle here. It says, the king said, I myself will also go out with you. So this is interesting. David this time says, I'll go out and fight, probably for a few reasons. One, he's showing personal courage here. He's showing that he's courageous. He's a strong leader, and he'll fight alongside the men. But also, remember when the whole Bathsheba thing happened? What was the problem? He was supposed to be out fighting, and he stayed back. So that's got to be in the back of his mind. Like, all right, I'm not letting anything else bad happen. I'm the king. I should be out on the battlefield, right? And maybe even another reason. There's probably, sometimes there can be multiple reasons, right, why these things happen. Another one, who are they going to battle against? His son Absalom. So he's like, I want to be there, just like we want to be there. I want to be there to make sure everything goes okay and goes as planned. So I'll be involved in this as well. He wants to have a little bit of a hand in this. So you can see a lot going on just in his statement there. If you read into it, there's a lot of reasons why he might want to do that. Continues on, but the men said, you shall not go out. For if we flee, they will not care about us. If half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore it is better that you send us help from the city. So the troops refused David's offer. They recognize his importance, which is very true. They're basically saying, you're not going to care about us, which, if you remember, Ahithophel did have this whole thing that they were just going to kill David alone. So and remember that whole plan from Hushai got to them. So they probably said, hey, listen, they're only coming for you. They don't even care about us. They do not care about us at all. You are worth 10,000, which they're making this big thing, showing them how important he really is. And they say, you know what a better strategy would be, David? If you stayed back and had the reserves ready to go. So if the battle goes bad, you can send out reserves and bring them out. So you're going to be in the reserves, right? And the military has that now. You send out people in the military. We always have reserves ready to go if things get bad, right? So this is a really wise plan here. And I love we see later on here in verse 4, then the king said to them, whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood at the side of the gate while all the army marched out by hundreds and by thousands. So I love this. David, a really good leader again. David had his own plan. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to lead you guys. I'm going to be a strong leader. And they say, whoa, wouldn't it be wiser if you stayed because you're so valuable and we go? And he yields to their counsel. It doesn't mean that he's a weak leader. It means that he thought about it and said, you know what, that's pretty wise. And the three of you all agree on that. I think that makes sense. So it shows that he's able to change his mind when a good plan is brought to him, right? And that's why it says kings are supposed to have many counselors. Only a fool would have no counselors, it says. So he's showing wisdom here, that he leads like a good king. And he's going to be here standing by the gate. And the city gate was where kings would give blessings and they give farewells there. So he's kind of standing at the end of the gate, kind of leading from the gate there, sending them all out. And again, it shows us sometimes true leadership, David's showing us, is letting go of control. That's a really hard thing to do, right? Especially when you want things to all go well, especially when Absalom is there fighting. But he knows what's best is to let go of control and really never let go of control because he knows God's in control. He's never really been in control. So if he trusts God, he doesn't have to be there. He can trust in his men that God will oversee it, and it was a wise plan. So he's going to let them and trust his men to lead. And you see here the order and unity, because all the army marched out by hundreds and thousands. So you can see there's that order and unity in David's army. They're very organized, ready to go in the battle. And it continues on. The king ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders about Absalom. And this is kind of a foreshadowing because he says this and says, hey, and everybody heard it. He said, be careful of Absalom. It wasn't some secret executive order meeting. Like, hey, shut the door. You 3 men come in here. It was no, for everybody to hear. I want you to win this war, but I want you to deal well with, what did he say? The young man Absalom. We could have maybe said, I want you to take out that traitor or that rebel or my enemy, right? Those are terms usually used in war. But he's still using this endearing language because it's his own flesh and blood. It's his son. Could you imagine having to go to war with your own relative that you loved? It's a crazy thought. But that's what David had to go through. So you can imagine the turmoil, which is why he's using this kind of language. And he's commanding them, listen, if you win the war, I don't want him dead or alive. I want him alive, right? You see those posters back in the day, dead or alive, we want him. But he did not want him dead. He's saying, hey, be really careful when you win this war. I know we got to win, but I want you to be gentle with the young man, Absalom. And everybody hears it, right? Everybody hears it. And you can see, actually, what's really interesting, too, is some things, of course, in the Bible playing out. Proverbs 17:25, a foolish son is a grief to his father. But you can see he is a grief to his father. It's causing all kinds of issues, but David still is having a tough time dealing with that. He's kind of like the prodigal father, or the prodigal son, the father of the prodigal son, where it says Solomon felt compassion and ran to him. You can still see David's heart there, probably hoping that Absalom would just turn and say, I surrender. I quit, Dad, it's your kingdom. That was probably David's greatest wish here. But you can see again that tension still living in David between justice and mercy. That's really hard as a leader, right? Should we bring justice for the crime and the sin committed? Or should I show mercy like the Lord shows? And he is struggling with this because he knows he needs to win the war, but he also wants to show mercy to his son. Verse 6. So the army went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. This is a really important piece here because forests were dense and rugged terrain. It wasn't like fighting out on a plain, right? It'd be like going out on a hike in the woods sometimes. You got to be careful where you walk. There's stones, there's snakes, there's trees, branches everywhere. So it was a really tough place to fight. And a forest, usually in the Bible, you see it in Isaiah chapter 10, it symbolizes or represents danger, entrapment, or judgment. So if you know this, you can look at this and say, uh-oh, something's about to happen. They're not having a battle in the usual plains of a battle or whatever it is. It's going to be fought in this rugged terrain. And we've got to remember that sometimes God uses the environment itself, right? We've seen that in Joshua. Remember Joshua was fighting, and you'll see later it'll say, the forest killed more men than the men, and that happened with Joshua. The hailstones killed more men than the actual soldiers did. So you can see God is in charge of the environment. He's in charge of nature. He's in control of this whole battle, and he is in control, coaxing them into this dangerous forest to have this battle. And it says in verse 7, the men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David, and the loss was great on that day, 20,000 men. That's not a small war. 20,000. Think about seeing 20,000 people in a football stadium or whatever, and imagine all them being killed in a war. That's a big, bloody battle. They were getting slaughtered. God was giving the battle right to David and his men. So the men of Israel, although that's tricky at first, you think it's David's men, that's actually, remember, the men of Israel, it said, had gone with Absalom. So those are Absalom's men dropping like flies, right? One by one. And it reminds us again of Psalm 33. The king is not saved by his great army, and the war horse is a false hope for salvation. You can see right here, God is the one winning all of the battle. And it says in verse 8, the battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest devoured. There it is, more people that day than the sword. And like I said, God is in charge. God's sovereignty reigns here. Nature is killing more men than the men themselves. So you can see again, God is the one fighting this battle. He can use his creation for anything, right? He can even use his creation for war. It's kind of a crazy concept. You can actually read in history, if you get into the world wars and stuff, when they went up and the Germans were going up to Russia, the winner is what saved. If you see the Germans could have taken over Russia, if you get into that history, The harsh winter had a real effect on war, and that stuff still happens today. So you can see God can use nature and still be fighting the battle without weapons. He can fight with his creation itself. All right, now I'll move into the part with Absalom here. And Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick of the branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. And look what it says there, he just happened to. Again, that's showing us there's a synchronicity here. From a human standpoint, like, wow, what are the odds of that? We're in the forest, he just happens to get stuck. But it's a sign here that God divinely ordered this. This is why God had the battle happen in the forest. If God had the battle happen in the plains, Absalom doesn't get stuck in a tree. It has to happen some other way, right? But remember earlier in 2 Samuel 14, verse 11, remember when that woman was doing that story in Tekoa, and I talked about how it was this weird prophecy where David said, as the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground. And he didn't know he was talking about himself. That ends up becoming prophetic and fulfilled because his hair is literally stuck in the tree. It does not fall to the ground. He is suspended, it says, between heaven and earth. And remember, when we got the Absalom's first explanation of who he was, we heard about his long flowing hair, and he'd get it cut only because it was so heavy. He's full of pride. So we see his pride ends up in destruction, which is exactly what the Bible is saying over and over again. He's also suspended between heaven and earth, which shows us he's been rejected by earth. He's been rejected by the men there, but he's also been rejected by heaven. So I know he's literally there, but you can also see a spiritual aspect. God is rejecting his kingship. The men on earth are rejecting. So he is balanced. He's hanging between heaven and earth. He is not accepted anywhere. And you can see that even in this literal sense as well as a spiritual sense. And now he's exposed and helpless. He thought he was this mighty warrior and control everything, and he's actually helpless. And guess what? He's been helpless and exposed this whole time. He's just now seeing it come to fruition here. In verse 10, a certain man saw it and told Joab, behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak. So instead of killing him, he goes and tells Joab. In verse 11, we see Joab said to the man who told him, what, you saw him? Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt. So remember, Joab is this fierce, ruthless, remember we talked about, he's a ruthless killer. He doesn't care about, gentleness. He doesn't care that David said to deal gently like this man did. He wants to kill him. He said, I would have given you a lot of rewards. I would have given you all this stuff for doing it. You would have been rewarded if you would have done it. So Joab shows he doesn't care about David and the compassion he wants on Absalom. He just wants violence and to settle the issues. And you can see what the problem with zeal without mercy is. The zeal of the Lord can be good, but without mercy it can get out of hand. That is like Joab's whole entire life as you read through this. Verse 12, but the man said to Joab, even if I felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not reach out my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, for my sake protect the young man Absalom. So the unnamed soldier is more loyal to David. He refuses a bribe. He shows us what good honor is. He could have had a lot of wealth from this. He could have been honored greatly, but he knew the right thing. Listen to the king, right? And it kind of reminds us of Psalm 119, although it's talking about God, but you can see even here, I have stored up your word in my heart that I might not sin against you. You can even see that little thing lived out here through this guy. He has integrity over riches. And I love what he says here in verse 13. On the other hand, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there's nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof. He's wise, he's not stupid. He's saying, Joab, if I would have killed him, you would have ratted me out and said I was the one that did it anyway. And the king always finds out. We couldn't have kept the secret from him. David finds everything out. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to be self-serving and disloyal. It would have come against me anyway, and you would have turned against me, Joab. This guy's pretty wise. He's turned down a bribe, and he knows, Joab, you would have backstabbed me. I'm not stupid, right? So Joab's probably even more furious, and he says, I will not waste time like this with you. It's typical Joab. And he took 3 javelins in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. So again, Joab's impatience and disregard for David's orders. He doesn't think about what the right thing to do is. He's just impulsive. Let's kill him now. And it's kind of excessive. 3 javelins to the heart. I think 1 would have killed him, right? Yeah, Matt does track. The javelins, they're pretty sharp. 1 through the heart would probably do it. You don't need 3. So you see Joab, and why is he mad? Well, remember when he set his field on fire? Probably is also in the back of his head. This guy turned against the king, and he set my field on fire. I can finally get revenge. And he overdoes it, right? He kills him 3 to the heart. So it shows Joab's disdain for Absalom. Verse 15, and 10 young men, Joab's armors, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. Joab, again, wise, has 10 other guys do it. So it's like, hey, David, it wasn't just me. There's 11 of us. There was these guys were killed. It's like, Joab, You stabbed him 3 times in the heart. He was going to die. And then you ordered these 10 men to do it. Like, come on, dude. So Joab is covering his tracks. So the guy that didn't kill him knew exactly who Joab was, right? Because Joab now covered it. It wasn't just me. It was all of us, right? It was all of us. Some people say, maybe there's also a truth to this too, but I think he's going to die anyway. That it's kind of like the firing squad. Well, we don't know who killed him. I stabbed him, but so did they. I don't know which one killed him. So it could be me, it could be them. I don't know who did it. So again, he's covering his tracks. Joab's wise, but also in a bad way here. He's kind of being a little cunning here. Then we see in verse 16, then Joab blew the trumpet, and the troops came back from pursuing Israel, for Joab restrained them. So remember, blowing the trumpet, it halts the battle when you blow the trumpet, which I think is really interesting. When Jesus comes back for us, they're going to blow the trumpet. Our war is over. We can come back from the battle. The Lord will take us home. So you can see that here. The trumpet always signals it's over. From distances away, the guys heard it and said, oh, cool, we won. Or we got to retreat, one or the other. But I think it's good. They're blowing the trumpet. Let's go home. So he does that. And he's not stupid. Joab actually shows restraint here. It's the one time you see Joab show restraint. Why is that? Well, because Joab could have kept killing men. There were still men in Absalom's army. But he said, you know what? I just wanted to make sure that there was no rebellion. I cut off the head of the rebellion. We're good now. We don't need any more bloodshed. We're all Israelites here. Let's go home. So you see, for once, Joab chill out. Because he could have kept going and going and going, but he really just wanted Absalom. Verse 17, and they took Absalom and threw him into a great pit in the forest and raised over him a great heap of stones, and all Israel fled, every one to his home. So you see, these men were not loyal to Absalom completely. They knew they were defeated. They flee, right? And they throw Absalom into a mass grave, heap of stones, which is a symbolic burial of a rebel or a traitor. So that's what that meant. If you remember back in Joshua 7, we saw this with Achan. Remember when he caused all that issue in the Battle of Ai, they lost because he stole the goods? Well, when they killed Achan, they actually threw him with heap of stones. So you can see that traitor against Israel buried as a rebel, right? And then, of course, like I said, the rebellion has collapsed. All Israel fled, and they seem to have won. And then verse 18, now Absalom in his lifetime had taken up and set up for himself the pillar that is in the king's valley, for he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar after his own name, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. So how ironic. Absalom decides before he's even dead, he's going to set himself up his own monument. What a prideful man. I need a monument because he's all about his legacy and his ego. And you find humans today that just want their legacy and ego. And it's actually kind of it's a trick. If fundraising stuff, which I hated being a part of this stuff, but if you wanted to do it, you said, hey, we'd set up a whole memorial in your name. And if you donate, we'll rename this thing after you. You see it all the time. Go around, look up the fields are named after, the halls are named after. You see people's legacies living on. So he's no different. He's a prideful man. But he said he had no son, which seems like a lie at first, because in 2 Samuel 14, we learned, remember, he had 3 sons and a beautiful daughter named Tamar. Remember, he named after his sister. So possibly his sons died young, which was possible back then. Or they died later on, and at some point his men were killed. Maybe his sons were in that battle, we don't know. But his 3 sons must have died, right? So he did have, at some point, they had died. And actually before this, because when he built the monument, he had no sons. And it was a way of him writing his own history. But in the end, it does become a legacy, because they keep it. But it's more to remember what Absalom did. So the Absalom's monument works, but in all the wrong ways. It's like, don't forget what Absalom did. He betrayed, his pride got messed up, and he ended up dead in a mass grave with rocks over top of him. So they keep the monument for a reason, but it's not what Absalom wanted it to be. His legacy is very tarnished, and he goes down in a bad way. His monument is now more the warning than a tribute. And then we'll go ahead and wrap up with the last couple of verses, 19 through 33. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, let me run and carry the news to the king, that the Lord has delivered him from the hand of the enemies. So remember, Ahimaaz is always eager to bring good news. He's been one of the spies bringing news to David, and he's finally getting to bring the final news that it's over. We've won. It all worked out, right? In verse 20, Joab said, you are not to carry news today. You may carry news another day, but today shall not carry news because the king's son is dead. Joab's not stupid. This isn't going to be a good message, man. Like, let this settle for a while. Let it relax, and then you can deliver him the news, right? Because this is not good right now. He's not going to get anything out of it, right? He's not going to get any reward, and he doesn't want him to get David's wrath. Because you get bad news, and you don't know how somebody's going to react to it, right? Especially because what David told them, and they all heard. Deal gently with Absalom. He was not dealt gently with at all. Verse 21, then Joab said to the Cushite, go tell the king what you have seen. So the Cushite bowed before Joab and ran. So the Cushite, probably an Ethiopian servant, is chosen instead. Why would Joab send this guy? Just told Ahimaaz not to. Well, Ahimaaz is important politically. Ahimaaz is a good faithful one, and this is some Ethiopian guy. If he gets killed, whatever. If David's mad at him, who cares? But Ahimaaz, you're going to stay here for another day. You'll deliver the news when it's good and more rewarding for you. So you can see again, Joab's a manipulator, right? That's what he really meant by all this. That's why he ends up sending another guy. And the Cushite, you can see, is loyal. He bows and runs immediately. A very loyal servant here. The next two verses, 22 and 23, then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, "Come what may, let me run also after the Cushite." And Joab said, "Why will you run, my son, seeing that you have no reward for the news?" There it is. "Come what may," he said, "I will run." So he said to him, "Run." Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and outran the Cushite. So Ahimaaz is determined, like, no, I've been a deliverer of news for a long time. It's not been good. I finally want to take good news to the king. I want to be there to be the one to tell him the battle is over and we've won. I deserve to do this. Joab says, "But you're not going to get rewarded. There's nothing good for you out of this." But Ahimaaz just wants to do it. But Joab's thinking all about what can I gain, right? What can I gain out of this? But he eventually gives in, and Ahimaaz beats the Cushite. Why? Because he's familiar with the terrain, right? He knows the shortcuts. It's like if you had somebody from out of town here and you said, "Hey, meet me out at the church," or whatever. They might take the long way, and you're like, "Oh no, I can take the back roads down Ross Road here and cut down here," and you still beat them. He beat him because he knew the terrain better. It even says, what do you say, he takes the plain there? Yeah, he took by the way of the plain and outran the Cushite. He wasn't necessarily maybe faster than the Cushite, but he knew the shortcut. He was familiar, because the Cushite's from Ethiopia. He doesn't know the terrain. Ahimaaz knows it like the back of his hand. He's been back and forth delivering messages. So he's going to break the news first. Ahimaaz is so excited. When we get down to verse 24, now David was sitting between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof of the gate by the wall, and when he lifted up his eyes and looked, he saw a man running alone. So David's still between the two gates. And this battle, it had been going on for a while. So you can see David's restlessness and worries, right? It's like the mom that's like, "I told my kid to be home by 10 p.m. and it's midnight. Where are they at?" And the parent doesn't go to sleep. You all know this. If you have kids, you don't go to sleep. And you stay up, you call their phone, they're not answering. I'm going to call their friend. They might be with them, right? You can see David. That's nothing new. David went through that same issue, like, what's going on out there? I haven't heard from anybody yet. Who's winning? Is Absalom still okay? You can see it. He's standing there waiting. And the watchman sees, and he called out and told the king, he told him about, he saw the man running. He said, if he is alone, there is news in his mouth. So David says, hey, usually a lone runner means there's a message here, right? There's usually a message coming through, a personalized report. It's not retreat. If it was a retreat, there'd be a lot of men running. There's one, so there's some news to report here. The watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gate and said, see, another man running alone. The king said, he also brings news. This might have surprised David, because two runners means there's urgency. So if one comes, that's one thing, but two men, it's like, uh-oh, what's going on? So now David's like, what is up? Why are two men because they're both messengers, it's not a retreat, but why are they both bringing news? Verse 27, the watchman said, I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. And the king said, he is a good man and comes with good news. So the watchmen, they've seen Ahimaaz before. He's been a servant. They know how he runs. They know his gait and how he walks and runs. They go, oh, I think that's Ahimaaz. And David, makes an assumption. Hey, Ahimaaz is a good man. He's been my spy this whole time. He's going to bring me some good news. I feel so good. It's Ahimaaz. He's bringing good news, but he's misreading the moment, right? Sometimes even the best messengers can bring painful truth, right? Doesn't mean if you're a good person, you're always going to have good news for the person. You have to just bring the news. So it's not always about who the messenger. That's why I say, don't shoot the messenger. Why do we say that? Messenger is trying to do the right thing, but it's going to be real bad news. This is where the term comes from, because people in their anger can mistake the messenger for the one who's responsible for the news, right? So David misreads the moment. As Ahimaaz is a good guy, but sometimes godly people bring hard truth. We're about to see that here. Verse 28. Then Ahimaaz cried out to the king, all is well. And he bowed before the king with his face to the earth and said, blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king. So he is so excited. There's peace, David. Peace, David. We finally won the war. And he bows in reverence. And he says, blessed be the Lord your God. So he even gives credit, Ahimaaz being godly, saying, God won this war for you, David. And it sounds like a perfect military report. Like, this is great. But it's an incomplete military report, right? Verse 29, and the king said, is it well with the young man Absalom? Ahimaaz answered, when Joab sent the king's servant, your servant, I saw a great commotion, but I do not know what it was. So David knows it's a good report, but he's like, wait a minute, I didn't hear anything about Absalom. That's why I've been waiting at the gate. I want to know how Absalom's doing, right? And the young man he kind of gets afraid, and he wants to be in good graces, so he dodges the question. This is what politicians do, right? You ask them a question about whatever, and they give you some answer, and they didn't really answer the question, right? Or they pretend they didn't know. That's what Ahimaaz does. So he does kind of care about the wrath. He's now kind of worried. It was funny. It was fun and dandy to be there to be the first one to deliver the message until David asked the hard question, and he didn't know. I didn't know he was going to ask me questions. I was just here to deliver news. I wasn't here for to give a whole PR press release here. I was just going to tell you what I thought, and he was probably afraid of fear because he's probably thinking, God told me not to do this. I shouldn't have come here. David's going to kill me. Oh, man, I'm an idiot. I shouldn't have ever done this. So you can see Ahimaaz is probably second-guessing himself here. But the king's wise. The king said, turn aside and stand here. So he turned aside and said until he says, hey, there's another runner. I know why there's another runner now. He has more news. You stand over here. I'm going to get the rest of the story from this guy. So David tells him to move along. And you can see here again, too. There's another reminder with the whole Ahimaaz thing. Sometimes people will give you partial truth because they don't want to hurt your feelings. But how good is that, right? Because the bad news comes no matter what anyway. You got to deliver all. If you want to be a good message, you have to deliver the whole message, even the good and the bad. I know it doesn't feel good, but you just have to do it. But we see here he's going to have to get this news from this other individual. Verse 31, and behold, the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, good news for my lord the king, for the Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all who rose up against you. So he brings a bold message. Cushite's like, cool, I have good news. I'm sure Joab didn't tip him off. Like, hey, this could be bad for you. Remember, he just sent him off. So the Cushite's ready. He's like, this is great news, David. All your enemies are gone. Right? So he doesn't hesitate to speak the truth. He just says it as it is. Verse 32. The king said to the Cushite, here's the question again, is it well with the young man Absalom? He's not going to let this go. And the Cushite answered, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man. So Cushite doesn't mention Absalom by name. He says, all your enemies be like that young man, but David knows that the young man Absalom. He knows who he's talking about. And this is a diplomatic way maybe to make it a little bit less harsh that Absalom died, but he's still saying, hey, may all your enemies die like your son Absalom did. And this is what David dreaded. This is why he waited at the gate. This is the news he never wanted to hear. And now he gets to hear it. And what happened? Look at verse 33. It's very telling. And the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son. It's one of the rawest, most emotional moments in all of Scripture. You can see he's torn apart because he didn't obviously want to fight in this war. He never wanted to fight Absalom. Absalom was picking the fight, right? And this had to happen. He didn't want him to die. He probably wanted to be a prisoner of war and somehow pray that he'd be restored, but it doesn't happen. And the Hebrew here actually shows us as he was shaking or trembling. So while he was just calling out, his body is literally shaking, almost like somebody in shock who gets news that their son is dead. They start trembling, shaking, and look, he says my son 5 different times. He can't control himself. My son, oh my son. He's like shaking. He's probably in shock. Even though he knew this is kind of coming, it's one thing to expect it and one thing to actually hear that it is true, right? So he's weeping out loud. And I love what he says here, though. It's really beautiful and prophetic, right? Would I had died instead of you. So what do we have here? King David would rather have died than his son died. He would rather die for his son's sins than his son died for his sins. And who is David? David is our earthly representation of Christ in the good moments, right? In the good moments. That's why the Chronicles write him as a better king there. It looks a little better because he's supposed to point to Jesus. And it's exactly what Jesus did, Romans 5:8. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. You can see Christ coming out through David here. I wish I could have died for you, so you didn't have to die. And it's exactly what Christ did for us in our place. So David's cry right here even is a shadow of Christ's substitutionary death on the cross for us. You can see it here, and I love that's why God writes the gospel all throughout all the books of the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament. But you can see it right there, and again, reminds you like, Father, forgive them. They'll do. I'll take their place. And that's how that ends. David is upset, which is this whole situation. This scene is going to cause issues. We'll see in chapter 19 as we get into that later. It'll be really interesting with how everything is dealt with here then. So does anybody have any questions or comments that they'd like to add regarding chapter 18 and what we read here, or anything it made you think of? All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Keep on reading. 2 Samuel 19, Lord willing, we'll be there next week. And until then, keep reading your Bibles, keep praying, and keep your lamps trimmed and burning.